So today I'm joined by Professor Amy Jo Levine and Professor Marc Brettler, and today's discussion is based on the Bible with and without Jesus. I will read an introduction to Marc Brettler real quick, since he has not been on the show before. And Marc Brettler is a member of the American Academy for Jewish Research and the Council of the Society of Biblical Literature, is a Bernese and Morton Lerner Professor of Jewish Studies in the Department of Religious Studies at Duke University, a Dora Golding Professor of Biblical Studies Emeritus and former chair of the Department of Near Eastern Studies and Judaic Studies at Brandeis University. He has also taught at Yale University, Brown University, Wesley College, and Middlebury College. He has also taught in various adult Jewish education settings, including the Wexner Heritage Program, the Innovative Maya Program in Boston, and has served as scholar in residence for the Foundation for Jewish Studies in Washington, D.C. He is actively involved in many aspects of Jewish communal life and has served on the board of Boston's Leventhal Sedman Jewish Community Center and Gon Academy of a New Jewish High School. A graduate of Brandeis University, has published and lectured widely on metaphor in the Bible, the nature of biblical historical texts, and gender issues in the Bible. So welcome back to the show, AJ Levine, and welcome, Marc Brettler.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Happy to be with you again.
That's good to have both of you with me. So I would like to start with, can y'all explain what it means that the Bible as a singular does not actually exist, that there are multiple different Bibles and interpretations of the Bible?
Okay, I'll start. So when we talk about Christianity, Mark and I use the term Old Testament to refer to Christian Bible Part 1. And when we talk about the Bible of Jews, we use the term Tanakh to talk about the Torah, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, the Nevi'im, or the prophets, and the Ketuvim, the writings. And the very idea that there were 2 different terms suggesting not only different order of books, but different reception history, because we read them through different lenses, sometimes different translations. We're not reading the same book. And consequently, when Christians say to us, Mark and I are both Jews, boy, you ought to be able to find Jesus in the pages of your Bible. Our response is, well, if you're reading the Old Testament, which is the Christian Bible Part 1, you can find him on every page. But if you take off the Christian lenses and you put on Jewish lenses, you're not going to see him at all.
Yeah, and I just add to that, it's not only in addition to the order being different, in some cases, the books of the Old Testament and the Tanakh are not identical. That is certainly the case for Catholics, where books of the Maccabees are part of the Catholic Old Testament, although often they get referred to as deuterocanonical or as apocryphal, but they're not, even though they're related to the Jewish holiday of Hanukkah, they're not part of the Hebrew Bible or of the Tanakh. Similarly, sometimes the same book will appear in different forms in different traditions. So, for example, it is well known that the book of Esther contains no direct references to the name of God. And that's true if you're Jewish, that's true if you're Protestant. But if you're Catholic, the book has what are called 6 editions. And it's not really important for us if someone added or somebody deleted, but 6 additional sections that are not there in the Hebrew, many of which actually do mention the name of God. So the books really are not the same.
What causes people to have varying interpretations of the Bible, and how is it linked to the issues pertaining to 2 Timothy, claiming that all of Scripture is God-breathed?
You have a problem right there that 2 Timothy is written under Paul's name, and many biblical scholars don't think Paul wrote 2 Timothy. It was written by one of his followers, continuing on his tradition, because something called pseudepigraphy, writing under somebody else's name, was fairly common back then. In fact, we have books attributed to Adam and to Enoch and to Noah, and I'm pretty sure they didn't write them. So what happens, the text is literature, and any literature, as soon as it's presented, any story, as soon as it's told, is going to receive multiple interpretations depending upon the people who interpret it. And if you have particular interpretive lenses, so Christians will interpret what they call the Old Testament through the lens of the New Testament, and Jews will interpret what we call the Tanakh through the lens of rabbinic literature. So there are multiple reasons why we would come up with different interpretations. I think that's part of what makes biblical literature so wonderful, is that it opens to different interpretations. And very often it's not a matter of one being right and one being wrong. To use the metaphor we talked about before, it's a matter of what pair of glasses you happen to be looking at the text with.
Yeah, and I'd say many people naively think that texts speak for themselves. Texts don't speak for themselves. Texts speak to particular individuals who are parts of particular communities. And we cannot, as individuals, strip away everything that we know before we read a text, allowing it to speak for itself. And furthermore, people, especially if we're reading the Bible as religious Jews or religious Christians, we are part of communities, and therefore interacting with the community and sharing some of the assumptions of that community are an integral and positive part of what we're doing as biblical interpreters.
Just to add to that, Mark and I tend to finish each other's sentences. We've been working together a long time. We have to bring in, I think it's morally responsible for us to bring in our contemporary concerns. So if we're reading something like in the New Testament, slaves be obedient to your masters, without having the moral sense of what slavery actually does and the legacy of slavery, not to address those concerns would be irresponsible on our part. Or when Paul talks about women, for example, women should be silent in the churches in 1 Corinthians. We bring in, or ideally we will bring in, contemporary concerns. So the texts are always going to take on new meaning over time as new issues keep cropping up.
Yeah, and since you started with 2 Timothy, obviously I'll say that text is not going to be significant for Jews. Different Jews have different attitudes about the extent to which the Bible is a revealed text, and whether the text that we have is indeed close to the original or the original text. And even traditional Jews who take the perspective of the Bible being revealed in some sense might not necessarily believe that the second and third parts of the Jewish Bible, the Nevi'im and the Ketuvim, the prophets and the writings, are revealed in the same sense that the Torah is. And one last, even Jews who believe that the Torah is a single book revealed to Moses, within medieval rabbinic interpretation. For example, the grandson of the great medieval Jewish interpreter Rashi, so the grandson's name was the Rashbam, he certainly was willing to interpret Jewish legal texts by recognizing that different books had different legal traditions, which sounds like a quite modern critical notion, but you find it right there. For example, since AJ mentioned the slave law, he distinguishes what the slave law means in Exodus from what the slave law means in Deuteronomy in his interpretations of Exodus chapter 21.
And does forging, people writing in the name of other people, can it cause complications in interpreting the various texts?
We prefer not to use the term forgery because it's got such a negative connotation, and we want to be sensitive to people who hold these various texts to be sacred, for whom the term forgery would be insulting. We don't want to insult our readers. So we're happier to use terms like pseudepigraphy or written in the name of someone else. People do that all the time. If you have a politician who gives a speech, it's not necessarily the case that the politician has written that speech. There are folks called ghostwriters who do that. I guess back when we're looking at the ancient text, we can call them holy ghostwriters. I'm sorry, I should not have said that.
That's really bad, AJ.
But the idea is that people would write in other people's names, in part to continue on that tradition. So most biblical scholars, unless they're very, very conservative, will presume that the prophet Isaiah did not write all of what we have now attributed to Isaiah, all 60 plus chapters, that there were a number of people in perhaps what might be considered a school of Isaiah. We know that some texts were written as appendices. We can see that in the Gospel of John, chapter 21, which is clearly an appendix written by somebody else to the person who penned or dictated chapters 1 through 20. So to write in somebody else's name is to honor that person, to continue the legacy, and also to spin that legacy in the way that the updating author wants it to go.
Yeah, and I'll add to that. So I'll start with AJ's example of Isaiah. So the Hebrew text begins, Chazon Yeshayahu, so the vision of Isaiah. And that whole verse is what is called a superscription or a title. But I do not know what that superscription or title was intended to cover. Was it intended to cover all 66 chapters? Was it intended to cover the first 39 chapters? Now, I really don't know. There's no marking in the book which indicates that. Furthermore, as biblical scholars, and indeed as scholars of religion and historians of religion, one of the greatest sins we think people can commit is the sin of anachronism, of imagining that things in antiquity were the same as they are now. And it is really important to realize that in a pre-copyright world, notions of authorship and notions of forgery were different than they are now. So I'm not quite as reticent as using the word forgery as AJ is, but I think that she's right. We need to respect different religious traditions, and we need to realize that forgery and authorship meant something different in antiquity than it did in modern times after the advent of the notion of copyright.
Can you tell us a little bit about the joke, two Jews, free opinions?
Well, you just saw a good example where AJ and I don't totally agree on the notion of forgery. It's not a joke. I mean, it's very serious. I think in many ways it goes back to a tradition in a midrash in Numbers Rabbah, which is a medieval Jewish midrash or type of interpretation on the fourth book of the Torah, fourth book of the Bible, the book of Numbers, which has the phrase Shiv'im Panim LaTorah. There are 70 facets of the Bible. And that means, and 70 there is just a typological or standard number, it shouldn't be taken literally, that there are multiple ways of interpreting the Bible, and that each of those ways is legitimate. That is very, very fundamental to the Jewish interpretation of the Bible. It is less fundamental, I'd say, at least to the Catholic interpretation of the Bible. And of course, in some ways, even though that phrase is not used within the Protestant tradition, in the Protestant tradition, starting with Luther, you have the notion of sola scriptura, where every individual in theory has the right to interpret the Bible the way in which he or she wants to. But I would actually say that there are more limits within the Christian tradition on that interpretation than there are. Actually, if Luther fully believed in this, why did he write interpretations of the Bible, which then became authoritative? But within Judaism, if you look at many Jewish texts, I'll give you just two standard examples. You look at what is called the Rabbinic Bible, in Hebrew, the Mikrot Gedolot. It has the biblical text either on top or in the middle, surrounded, and this already begins in the 16th century, with different medieval biblical commentaries who often disagree with each other. One will often call the other a fool, or in rare occasions, an idiot, and they are on the same page. That illustrates the notion of Shiv'im Panim LaTorah. There are 70 faces or facets to the Bible. Or to take another example, an earlier example from classical rabbinic interpretation, rabbinic midrash does not typically have a single interpretation for every verse or every phrase, but rather will have a variety of midrashim, a variety of interpretations for each phrase. And those interpretations are distinguished from one another by the phrase davar acher, the Hebrew phrase which means another interpretation. And what davar acher does, another interpretation does, is it says, yes, there are a variety of possible interpretations. And sometimes there could be quite a few, many more than two or three interpretations of a single phrase, verse, or word. And davar acher, another interpretation, is a way of saying each of these is legitimate. It is not saying, oh, the first one is sort of interesting, but the second one is pretty good, and the third one is really one that's really correct. The Bible as a text within Judaism is fundamentally open to a multiplicity of interpretation, because the very nature of the biblical text is that it has many different legitimate meanings.
To add to that, so the text has many legitimate readings. So why is it that Jews have two Jews, three opinions? And within at least some streams of Christianity, when you look at Genesis or Isaiah, it only has one meaning. And that's because Jews and Christians do not comport ourselves differently. Jews are a people. The Hebrew would be the Greek would be ethnos. So we're a people or a nation, like Americans. So two Americans, three opinions. I mean, just shift from Fox News to MSNBC, and you can watch it in practice. We can do that because we're all a member of a community, and people can't throw us out. But if you get into a system not because it's a nation or a people and or an ethnos, but you get in by belief, because the early followers of Jesus weren't there because of ethnicity. They were there because of what the Gospel of John calls being born from above or being born anew. Well, if you get in by belief, you don't want to argue too much, because if you argue too much, you're going to get out by belief. In other words, you're going to be called a heretic. So what generally happened, at least concerning Christian interpretation of Christian Bible Part 1, the Old Testament, was the general view was it all pointed to Jesus, or more broadly, it pointed to the Trinity. And therefore, you didn't need any other explanations because you knew what it was doing. And then you could find in the New Testament the idea that when Jesus fulfills something or is said to have fulfilled something, that tells you what the Old Testament means. So two Jews, three opinions, because Jews are a people. One text, one dominant opinion? Yes, because Christianity is a religion.
Yeah, and a religion which has a center. And that center is the belief in the significance of the birth, death, and especially the resurrection of Jesus. Judaism, as even I don't know if I could call it a religion, Judaism as a set of beliefs affiliated with the people does not have a center. And therefore, the notion of, and this is a term which James Kugel, who taught for many years at Harvard and then moved to Israel and now is retired, he created a word for Jewish interpretation of the Bible called omnisignificance, which actually goes beyond the notion that there are 70 facets of the Bible. It is omni. It's a very good word if you play bananagrams. I think it has too many letters for Scrabble. But in any case, omnisignificance is just the opposite of reading the text, in this case, the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament, through the lens of the New Testament and being Jesus-centric in your reading. There's nothing that centers any readings of the Tanakh for Jews in the same way that there is for Christians.
What is the difference between Christian interpretation aligned with belief and that of Jewish interpretation?
Well, you don't have to believe anything to do Jewish interpretation. So you have Jews who self-identify as Jews, but also identify as atheists, some of whom are very, very good biblical readers. It's rare for Christians to identify as atheists because the idea of Christianity presumes some sort of specific role, not just human, but supernatural role with Jesus. Granted, there are some Christians who might be called Jesus-centric Christians who are interested in things like the Sermon on the Mount or the parables, who don't have much concern for things like the incarnation, the resurrection, and so on. But for the most part, Christianity is a belief-based system. Judaism is not.
Yeah, I mean, there's even a book, a very good book called Must Jews Believe in Anything? And this has been something which Jews have really been debating for the last 300 years. So, two facts, and as a biblical scholar, I have relatively few facts, that the great medieval Jewish thinker and philosopher Moses Maimonides indeed did put together a set of 13 ikarim, 13 fundamental Jewish beliefs. But Maimonides' books were burned by quite a few Jews soon after he wrote them. And people disagreed with many of his 13 beliefs. So you really don't see that. And it really is a continuing debate on whether or not belief is central to Judaism, with many people arguing that mitzvot, performance of commandments, is really what is at the center of Judaism, rather than the one belief or another.
Oh, and just to add to that, so the performance of the mitzvot, which is a Hebrew term, it means commandment, but it really has the sense of doing the good thing, doing the right thing. We don't do that to earn divine love, particularly those of us who don't believe in anything. Those who are believing do it in response to the love that God showed in giving the people the commandments in the first place. But you can choose how to act. So I don't have to believe in a divinity. I don't have to believe in heaven and hell to know that it's a good thing to treat my neighbor with kindness and compassion. So one performs the commandments because that makes you a decent person. I know a number of Christians who will say to me, like, if we didn't have belief in heaven and hell, then we wouldn't be doing good things. And the reason we do good things is because we're afraid of going to hell. That's not a Jewish issue. And I actually don't think it's a terribly healthy way of looking at God either. Because if the only reason one acts with love toward neighbor or one towards love toward stranger is because you're afraid of getting whacked by this bully God, it's pretty awful theology.
And I'll just say, please find hell for me in the Old Testament or in the Tanakh.
It's not that.
I think it's a great way of getting people to read it from cover to cover. Because, as AJ just said, it is not there.
What is polemic?
Well, we could fight about the definition. I'm sorry. The term comes from the Greek word polemos, which means war or battle. So polemic is a rhetorical form where you take aim and shoot at the positions you do not like. And by extension, you take aim and shoot at the people who hold those positions that you do not like. So arguing against somebody else rhetorically is a rhetorical form called polemic.
Yeah, and I think the title of our book and a story related to the title of our book is a good illustration of why we don't engage in polemic. So the book is called The Bible with and Without Jesus. And as the book was being edited, we once got back a version where the title was changed to The Bible with or Without Jesus. And we both had a fit, because that is totally antithetical to what we're doing. This is really an and book. Like, we recognize that the relationship between Judaism and Christianity has been fraught for more than a millennium and a half. But we also realize, or at least hope, that we're in a different time where we're able to talk about the same text, or more or less the same text, even if we give it different titles, and to talk about it, recognizing that we may not have the only correct way of looking at that particular text. And thus, I think one of our chapters is called From Polemic to Possibility, or something like that, where we want to move away from polemic. I think I grew up with polemic. I suspect some of the other people who are listening to this or seeing it have grown up with polemic. But polemic is not the only way not the only way of understanding religious texts. And I would really argue not even the best way of understanding religious texts. We really need to have the ability to open our ears and our hearts to other readings of texts and to say, listen, because of who I am, that is not how I am going to read the text for myself. But I can understand in a sympathetic and I hope non-condescending way why you are reading the text that way within your religious tradition. And that is really why AJ and I wrote this book.
What causes some Christians to think that the book of Genesis implies a Trinity? They'll see something in Genesis 1, let us make man in our image, or the three angels or three people. Like Abraham looked up at God, or he looked up and saw three standing over him in Genesis 18. I think that's where it is.
Mhm.
Can y'all talk about that?
Sure. Well, part of the reason we read differently is because of translation. So even if we look at the very beginning of Genesis, where we have this ruach thingy, the Greek is pneuma, hovering over the face of the deep. Well, the word for wind is the same word as the word for breath, is the same word as the word for spirit. So do you see the Holy Spirit hovering over the deep? I mean, you can get that from retrospective reading if you've got spirit later on in the text, and then you've got a Holy Spirit later on in the text, and you've got a belief in the Trinity. Well, boy, there you are right in Genesis chapter 1. But if you read in the context of, say, ancient Near Eastern mythology, basically what you got is a mighty wind, like a gale force, or even a gentle breeze. So translation will make a difference. When God says, let us make humankind, I mean, whether we translate man is yet another problem. The Hebrew ha-adam is like the earthling. Let us make humankind. They say, who's the us? And the early church fathers, Tertullian is very, of course, this is the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. It's evident. And the rabbis, the rabbinic tradition, which is aware of these Christian readings, are saying, no, it's not. Because when you go on, the person who's speaking speaks grammatically in the first person singular rather than in the first person plural. So we're not talking about three separate identities or even a Trinity. This is just God, perhaps talking about the royal court, the heavenly court, or the heavenly host.
Yeah, let me take the Genesis 18 example because I like that one. So I think it is inevitable, and this is not at all a criticism, that if you're Christian and you hear the number 3, it is going to have a certain resonance for you. And for Jews, it's not going to have that same resonance. So when there are 3 visitors in Genesis chapter 18, it is, especially once it becomes clear that these are angelic or supernatural, or however you want to understand them, visitors, it is natural for a Christian reader to understand them as a Trinity, because we are reading as individuals based on certain preconceptions. And we can only be so successful, never completely successful, in stripping those preconceptions away. And indeed, the cover of the book, I have no idea if this is going to work. Where am I? Yes, the cover of the book has a wonderful picture on the bottom, which is a Chagall picture of the 3 angels in Genesis chapter 18. Now, what I love about this picture, and it's really a nod to what the book as a whole does, is that it is a picture which is based on a medieval icon, and which obviously is Christian if we're talking about medieval icons. And Chagall, as a Jew, is using that medieval icon. If you go back and look at that picture, those angels actually have halos around them, which is very much a part of the Christian tradition. So the book cover itself is a way of saying, we are giving a nod toward how the different Jewish and Christian traditions each have integrity and are interrelated in a manner which is much more complicated than most people realize. So thank you for bringing up Genesis chapter 18.
Can y'all talk about the 2 creation accounts in Genesis? What is the deal with those 2 creation accounts?
Well, the deal is quite simple. The Bible is, again, I'm back to the anachronism issue. The Bible is not a book in the sense in which we think of books. The Bible is a compilation, is an anthology. And in the case of the book of Genesis, or indeed the case of the first 5 books, the Torah or the Pentateuch, there were various pre-existing books, or more properly scrolls, each of which told stories which were different to one extent or another. At some point, and all of the evidence for this is indirect, but is incredibly strong to my mind, and I can give you some of that evidence in a second, somebody decided that in creating the story of ancient Israel, it is not the case that one tradition should be prioritized over the other, but rather the various different traditions need to be considered. Not all of them. There was a selection of traditions. So here the New Testament offers a wonderful example. Why is it that we have 4 Gospels, which are so very, very different, and some very, very basic issues, such as who saw Jesus when Jesus returned? And that's a classic example of differences between the various Gospels. And if you look at any Gospel parallel, you'll see many such issues. So in antiquity, it was not so unusual. And this is a great example for today, for people to say, listen, different people have different traditions. Let's preserve a bunch of them rather than preserving only one of them and leaving the others aside and allowing them to go into oblivion. So that is what people did in antiquity. Unless one of your readers or listeners, viewers say, hey, but the 4 Gospels remained as separate Gospels. Well, there was a very important early Christian figure called Tatian, who created something called the Diatessaron, which was an early type of gospel harmony, which combined the different Gospels exactly the way in which different creation stories and all the different stories were combined at the beginning of the book of Genesis. And in terms of there being different stories with clearly different ideas, listeners, watchers, please go open your Bibles. And I'll just ask you 2 very, very simple questions. In what order were the following elements created? Birds, land animals, man, and woman. And you'll see that the answer is different in Genesis 1 and in Genesis 2 and 3. Or depending on the translation you use, if you use a correct translation, which is not interested in harmonizing the different biblical accounts, in how many days did creation transpire? Genesis chapter 1 is quite clear that there's a 6-day creation, followed by the Sabbath of divine rest on the 7th day. Well, Genesis 2, the second part of verse 4, uses the word biyom, in the day of. So that seems to imagine a 1-day creation. So you said, Jacob, quite legitimately, what's the story? Well, the story is that this was a theory which was developed not to do anything bad to the Bible, not to strip the Bible of any sort of authority, but to explain certain fundamental difficulties in the biblical text, whether it's the 2 creation stories, or people can look at Genesis chapter 12 and Genesis chapter 20, which tell the same brother-sister story about Abram and Sarai, or Abraham and Sarah, set in different places with different details. And actually, I think it's a wonderful model, because we are so concerned these days about who is right. And the Bible, whether it's the Tanakh, is represented in the book of Genesis, the Torah as a whole, or indeed the Tanakh as a whole, or the Gospels, or differences between the Gospels and the writings of Paul. These collections or anthologies seem to suggest, hey, maybe we don't need to have only one perspective, but it is okay to have, as Bible, a book which has a multiplicity of perspectives, which maybe encourages people to be less fundamentalistic, to be less polemical, and to think more about possibilities rather than polemics. Sorry about going on so long. I feel strongly.
Oh no, it was great. I like long answers. Why is Jesus called a high priest in the Order of Melchizedek? And what else do we know about the Order of Melchizedek? Do we have any other text other than the Epistle to the Hebrews that tells us anything about that organization?
I love the idea of an organization, like they have synodal meetings every 5 years. So Melchizedek shows up in Genesis 14. So Melchi means king of, and Zedek means righteousness. So he gets identified as king of righteousness. In some traditions, he's also the king of a place called Salem, which then gets associated with Jerusalem, but it may also be associated with Shechem. And he's also called the king of peace. So he's got a lot of titles, but we're not exactly sure to what exactly they apply. And in Genesis, it turns out that Abraham winds up paying tithes to Melchizedek. Well, that's interesting. And then he kind of disappears. He shows up again in Psalm 110, which is notoriously difficult in the Hebrew. Like nobody's quite sure what the Hebrew says, really quite difficult to translate. And in the Greek translation of Psalm 110, you have something that looks like the Order of Melchizedek. Not clear in the Hebrew at all. But the followers of Jesus reading their text in the Greek come up with this idea of the Order of Melchizedek. And the epistle to the Hebrews, which I have to explain to my students, Jews don't read, although it's called the epistle to the Hebrews, it's not in our canon, and it's not clear that it was written to a group of Jews anyway. We're not sure who the author was, although traditionally attributed to Paul. Paul didn't write it. The style's completely different. The ideas are completely different. We don't know when it was written, and we don't know to whom it was written. Hebrews, instead of looking at Jesus in the Son of David model, or in the Son of God model, or talking about Son of Man, puts Jesus not in the royal tradition, but in the priestly tradition, having him be in the order of Melchizedek. Why? Because you can't get him into the priestly order according to Judaism, because in Judaism, to be a priest is an inherited tradition. If your father's a priest, you're a priest. And if your father's not a priest, there's nothing you can do about it. Right? So it's clear from everywhere else in the New Testament that Jesus is associated with the family of David. The family of David is of the tribe of Judah. In order to be a priest, you have to be of the tribe of Levi, different son of Jacob, different traditions. So in effect, Hebrews develops, we could even say invents, the idea of this order of Melchizedek, who has neither father nor mother nor genealogy, and then you plot Jesus into that order, and that's how you get Jesus being high priest and more. Because Hebrews is fascinating. Jesus is not only the best high priest ever, he's also the ultimate sacrifice. And instead of looking toward the future, which is what much New Testament writings do, there's the now and there's the future when Jesus comes back. Hebrews tends to look at things more spatially rather than temporally. So while we are here on earth, Jesus is serving both as high priest and as ideal sacrifice up at that heavenly altar. So it's much like Plato. You have what's on earth, but then you have the true thing up in heaven. And Hebrews is using this Platonic model to suggest that Jesus is this high priest. More than that, because you said you like long answers, Hebrews is actually very Platonic, because when it talks about Abraham paying tithes to Melchizedek in the wilderness and talks about the wilderness tabernacle, for Hebrews, all that ancient stuff, all that quote unquote Old Testament stuff is just a foreshadowing, a type, a shadow of the true stuff that gets revealed in Jesus.
So let me add just a drop to that. So the key text is really Psalm 110, which, as AJ noted, is notoriously difficult. Yet, and here it's important to realize that the early Christian, or even the earlier Christ-believing community, before the term Christians was used of them, viewed the book of Psalms as prophetic, okay, which, by the way, the book itself does not say, and there are many different understandings of how the book of Psalms as a whole functioned, and of course of prophetic, specifically about Jesus. And that explains why not only in Hebrews, but throughout the New Testament, there are many texts in Psalms. Perhaps Psalm 22, which we have a chapter about, is the most famous of them, which understand particular Psalms about Jesus. And going back to what we were talking about earlier, it is natural, if you're a Christian, to read texts in a Christ-centered manner. So the only verse of Psalm 110 at the last three verses are clear, and the first verse is clear. And once you have the superscription, LeDavid Mizmor, a Psalm of David. The next 5 words read in Hebrew, perfectly clear Hebrew. Ne'um Adonai Ladoni, Shev Limini. The speech of the Lord to my master, sit to my right. If you're a Christian, I mean, it's obvious that this is God speaking to Jesus. And if that's the case, if Jesus is the addressee, then when you get to verse 4, where this individual is being spoken to in the second person, you are a priest to me forever, concerning or because of the meaning of Hebrew uncertain, Melchizedek. And I don't even know if Melchizedek is a personal name with a capital M, or should be read as my righteous king. Okay, we'll leave that whole issue aside. But it should be clear to any early Christ-believing reader that this verse has to be referring to Jesus, because it's continuing the second person that was mentioned in verse 1, who is sitting to the right of God. So it's obvious if you have a certain set of assumptions.
What else are we told about Melchizedek in later Jewish texts and tradition?
Oh, Melchizedek shows he was kind of big in Second Temple Judaism. So there's a lovely story about Melchizedek's birth. His parents are Noah's brother and his wife. And suddenly Noah's brother's wife turns up pregnant, but Noah's brother turns out to be a priest. Who knew? And because he's remaining in a state of ritual purity in order to serve God at the altar, the child could not be his. So, suddenly the wife is pregnant. This is not good. Turns out to be pregnancy by some supernatural means, whatever. She dies. And in dying, gives birth to this child who comes out apparently dressed in high priestly garments and looks like he's 3 years old and he can talk. And that turns out to be Melchizedek. So although we have this idea that he is without father or mother or genealogy, tradition abhors a vacuum. So they're going to provide him father, mother, and genealogy. And he's back there in the antediluvian period, the period before the flood. And he continues on to the time of Abraham, because not only is he without genealogy, he's also apparently ageless. So there's a lot of stuff about him because he's mysterious. Because of Psalm 23, where people weren't exactly sure what this whole Melchizedek thing was. They weren't sure why Abraham, who really is the hero of the beginning part of Genesis, would be paying tithes to Melchizedek. Why shouldn't it go in the other direction? So people were curious about this mysterious, in fact, priest king. How do we know he's a priest? Because in Genesis, he offers a sacrifice. Who could this be?
Yeah, what AJ just added is really important. In other words, this is a guy who is super important in Second Temple Judaism. So therefore, given that the early Christ-believing movement, which produced the New Testament, is really part of Second Temple Judaism, or a little bit later than that, it is not so surprising that they would make such a big deal out of Melchizedek. But in later Judaism, he becomes much less important. Now, might he have become much less important because he was so important in Christianity, therefore Jews decided to shun and perhaps to ignore him? That's possible, though that's very, very hard to prove. But I think if you take, it's a great example of how Jews and Christians read the Tanakh or the Old Testament differently. Take the average Jew and ask them, who's Melchizedek? And they'll say, I have no idea, you tell me. Because he's so important in the epistle to in Hebrews, which is not really an epistle, even though it gets called an epistle, but so important in Hebrews, Christians are very well aware of him. And this brings up something else, which goes back towards something we said at the very beginning about different Jewish and Christian readings of either the Old Testament or the Tanakh. For Christians, Psalm 110 is a very important psalm. So I like imagining these psalms, in theory, being written in different font sizes. So I would call Psalm 110 a 36 or 48 point font. Okay. For Jews, Psalm 110 never appears in the liturgy. I think maybe it might be something anti-Christian, or it might just be, how can such an obscure psalm serve any liturgical function? So it's not there in the liturgy. For Jews, it's like a tiny 3-point font psalm. So Jews and Christians should not assume that even though they share, in some sense, the Tanakh and the Old Testament, that each of their communities thinks that each text within it has equal amount of importance. And the different attitudes toward whether it's Psalm 110 or whether it's Isaiah chapter 53, which deals with the suffering servant, those are two very good examples on the same text, more or less, which have very disproportionate senses of importance in the two religions.
Just one other thing to develop this. We had talked about polemic before, and there is some rabbinic material on Melchizedek, which I actually think is polemical against Christians. It's a kind of diminution of Melchizedek. You thought he was important. Let me tell you, he's not as important as you thought he was. And he lost his priesthood, and things are not good. So, whereas it may be that Christian polemic, and I'm using the term Christian here to suggest like not Jewish at all, early Christian polemic against Judaism, like you lost your temple, your laws are silly, or your laws are antiquated, or your laws of forms of punishment, whatever. Those may be better known, the adversus Judaeus, the anti-Jewish tradition among the church fathers. There are some comments in rabbinic literature that are adversus Christianus. Not many, and most Jews have never seen them or heard of them, because most Jews don't own a copy of the Talmud and don't have the competency to read it. But there's some polemical material there. So there was a little bit of a tug of war with Melchizedek and how he was going to cash out in each of the different traditions.
Yeah, and I'll say in terms of that, some of that material being in the Talmud, it's also going to depend on what edition you own, because some of that material was either censored out in terms of self-censorship by the Jews or censored out by Christian censors. So a lot of the material which does talk about Jesus in the Talmud is not found in the standard version of the Talmud. But that's a whole other lecture.
Can you tell us about the antithesis or extensions regarding Matthew 5-7?
So a number of our Christian friends talk about, well, Jews are interested in retributive justice, this eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, whereas Jesus is interested in restorative justice. You know, you've heard it said, an eye for an eye, but I say to you, if someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to me the other. So the comment from Jesus is in the Sermon on the Mount in a section that's traditionally called the antitheses. An antithesis is an opposite. But for the most part, Jesus is not engaging in antithetical material at all. The antithesis begins with Jesus citing, you have heard it said, you shall not murder, and whoever murders is liable to judgment. And then Jesus says, but I say to you, if you're angry with a brother or sister, you're already guilty. That's not an antithesis. An antithesis would be, you have heard it said, you shall not murder, but I say to you, lock and load and take out as many as you can. That's an antithesis. That's an opposite. What Jesus is doing is not making an antithetical statement, but he's extending the original commandment. So the original commandment is don't murder. And what Jesus does is what rabbinic literature, this is the Mishnaic document, Perkei Avot, Ethics of the Fathers, chapter 1, verse 1, says, listen, build a fence about the Torah. You have a law, make another law to make sure you don't violate the first one. So the law says don't murder. Jesus extends that by saying don't be angry, because if you're not angry, you're less likely to murder. To the law that says don't commit adultery, Jesus says don't think about it, because if you think about it, then you'll plan it. And if you plan it, you're more likely to do it. To a law that says don't commit a false oath, Jesus says don't say, just don't make an oath at all. Why put yourself at risk? And then people walk around saying things like cross my heart, which is technically taking an oath. It's just be honest. And when it finally comes to this issue of an eye for an eye, Jesus doesn't change the law. He changes the subject, because there's a huge difference between having somebody poke out your eye or knock out your tooth, and getting what is in effect a backhanded slap across the cheek, which is not meant to do damage. It's meant to humiliate. So he's using here the so-called lex talionis, the law of talion, as an opportunity to talk about what do you do if somebody is being violent toward you, and how do you respond? He hasn't changed the law; he's changed the subject.
How does the New Testament deal with adultery and divorce compared to the Old Testament, or is it roughly the same?
That's quite different. Deuteronomy gives questions about how you get divorced, right? And you get a certificate of divorce if you get divorced. So it presumes divorce. Jesus knows that divorce is presumed, but in the first century, people were debating under what circumstances could you get divorced. So divorce is a contract. How do you break the contract? And there were some more conservative folks at the time of Jesus who were saying only in cases of adultery can you get divorced, which, by the way, also tells us that they're not stoning people for adultery, because if you're stoning people, you go right from the action to the stoning. You don't have to go to the court to get the divorce. I mean, you're already dead. And there are other people who are basically saying it's no fault, right? Because Deuteronomy's not clear. It says a matter of impropriety, or however you want to translate that. Something inappropriate, something sexually inappropriate. So people are debating this, which is why in Matthew, the Pharisees say to Jesus, is it lawful to get divorced for any cause? That was the issue. No fault or for any cause. And then Jesus says, depending upon which text you read, in Mark and in Luke, no divorce and no remarriage after divorce. And Paul knows this, because in 1 Corinthians, he says, I have it as a word of the Lord, don't get divorced. And then he goes on to say, because he's a pretty decent pastor, but you can separate for a certain period of time by mutual agreement. In the Gospel of Matthew, still in the Sermon on the Mount, by the way, Jesus in Matthew says you can't get divorced except in cases of, the Greek term is porneia. And that's where we get the English word pornography. A porne is a prostitute. Porneia is some sort of sexual indiscretion. It doesn't mean adultery, although adultery might be grandfathered into the general category, because there's a different word for adultery. So could it mean an incestuous marriage that you would have contracted and then you joined the Jesus movement and your marriage was inappropriate according to Levitical codes, for example, or something that was coerced? Or were you flirting? We simply don't know. So Jesus appears to have forbidden divorce. Matthew gives this porneia loophole, which is very difficult to define. Eventually, churches decided it meant adultery. Why? At the same time that Jesus is forbidding divorce, he's also separating husbands and wives. As he says in Luke, unless you hate your father, your mother, your wife, and your kids, you can't be part of me. We know that Peter joined the movement, but Jesus heals Peter's mother-in-law, which means Peter was married, but Mrs. Peter doesn't show up in the Gospels. Jesus is always a bridegroom. He's never a bride. He commends in Matthew, again in Matthew 19, people who make themselves eunuchs. In other words, people who are non-productive. And that could mean, if you don't get married, you're less likely to be productive because you don't have a sanctioned relationship. So he's forbidding divorce. On the other hand, he's promoting celibacy. Celibacy is not a big deal in the scriptures of Israel at all. And divorce is permitted. The question is under what circumstances. And when we get up to the rabbinic literature, the rabbis debate under what circumstances, with some taking a no-fault view and others taking only in cases of adultery. And the rabbis generally shut the door on celibacy because they read with the idea of you should be a parent and you should produce children because that's what you were in part put on earth to do.
And
You're muted, Mark.
Yeah, I would just add, since we're talking about celibacy, very often the Jesus movement gets talked about in relation to the Dead Sea Scrolls. And there it is noteworthy that at least many scholars think that the people who lived there, that it was an all-male community, it was a celibate community. But something else that really needs to be talked about in terms of notions of celibacy and leaving your family, at least for many or some in the Jesus movement, there was a sense that they are living I don't really want to call it the end of time, because time doesn't end. So I really hate that English translation of end of time. But at a turn of a fundamentally different era. And some of the people in the Dead Sea Scroll community believe that as well. And if you believe that you're living in such an era, then perhaps it's not a great idea to get married, not a great idea to have children. So it is really, really important in terms of understanding certain New Testament ideas about celibacy and family to remember that particular situation that many of the people believed they were living in at this particular time.
And to make it even closer, Jesus, in talking about no divorce, sets up Deuteronomy over against the book of Genesis. From the beginning, it was not so, but a man leaves his father and mother and sticks to his wife, and they become one flesh. And that's where you get what God has put together, let no person put asunder. The Dead Sea Scrolls use exactly the same argument from Genesis in their comments about divorce.
What do y'all think of an eye for an eye in comparison to turn the other cheek?
I think they're two different subjects. If somebody pokes out my eye and the response is, well, here, turn the other one, I'm not going to find that helpful. In fact, in the end of the day, I'm going to be blind and in pain. So the very idea of letting somebody abuse somebody else's body without, just felt like having a bad day, I think is completely unhelpful. There's that old line, if we always did an eye for an eye, then the entire world would be blind. On the other hand, if we didn't have a sense of justice, then we couldn't function either. So what rabbinic literature does is say, well, an eye for an eye is not to be taken literally. This is interpretation. And we never see it taken literally in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh. But it's a legal principle. Why? Because no two eyes are the same. I have terrible eyesight. So if you have 20/20 vision and you take out my eye and then I decide to take out yours, I'm taking a whole lot more from you than you're taking from me. So therefore, since an eye for an eye cannot be done literally, and it would also be kind of stupid to do, therefore, there must be some sort of compensation in the case of actual physical injury. And the Mishnah Baba Kama, and then the Talmudic tractate based on that Mishnah, explained that in a case of actual physical injury, there has to be monetary compensation for things like pain, medical expenses, loss of work due to injury, and so on. I think that's a very good idea. And I also think turning the other cheek in the case of not losing a limb, but in the sense of being grossly insulted, being treated as somehow less than in the image and likeness of God, being treated as not worthwhile or marginal, to say, instead of responding to you with the same amount of violence, which is just going to exacerbate the situation, and instead of responding by, fine, treat me like a non-human, treat me like I'm worth nothing, which loses your own dignity, the idea of standing up to your oppressor and saying, treat me like an equal, and I refuse to respond with violence, and at the same time, I refuse to back down, I think that's really smart. I also think, based on traditions we have of Jews in the first century dealing with Romans, it's a very Jewish way of responding. It's a very smart way.
And let me just tie something that AJ said to something that we talked about at the very beginning. You asked us about two Jews, three opinions. The understanding of an eye for an eye as monetary is one of the relatively few cases where rabbinic tradition is unanimous that it is monetary rather than literal. So that is very important to remember. And there are some very good biblical scholars who have suggested that even the Bible itself, based on the syntax that is used, it really does refer to money, monetary compensation, already in the biblical period as well. And as AJ pointed out, there are no cases in the Hebrew Bible where an eye for an eye is applied literally. Because I think
what is the sacrificial?
Don't we need to wrap it up soon?
If y'all have to go, we can end in a moment. I did have a few more questions. Did you want me to just ask a couple more and skip some of them?
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I don't imagine
We've been going for an hour. We have work.
I don't think the podcast.
I understand.
they'll be longer than an hour, right? So, and we've been at it for an hour. So maybe ask one more and something to wrap it up, please.
Sure. What is the sacrificial lamb, and why is Jesus connected with it?
The Levitical system has lots of different types of sacrifices, most of which don't have to do with sin. We do Thanksgiving offerings and peace offerings and harvest offerings and whatnot. In the Gospel of John, at the beginning, John the Baptist sees Jesus and says, "Behold the Lamb who takes away the sin of the world," which, if your friends are familiar with various forms of Eucharistic worship, will sound familiar. And then in the Gospel of John, Jesus repurposes the Passover offering, which is not a sin offering, to turn it into a sin offering. And then Jesus dies according to the Gospel of John, but not according to Matthew, Mark, and Luke, at the time that the lambs are being sacrificed in the temple for the Passover meal that night. So John takes the Passover offering, turns it into a sin offering when it wasn't, and then associates Jesus with the Paschal offering. There you go. That's the quick version.
Yeah, and I would just add, again, this is a case of where we just need to be more sympathetic to antiquity. Sacrifice was a fundamental part of the ancient religious world, and not only in ancient Israel, but in Rome and Greece. A typical way of showing thanks toward the deity is by offering back to the deity something that the deity has given to you. In this case, an animal as a gift to the deity. Again, it's not only animals that were used in the Hebrew Bible, also there were various grain offerings as well. So this was a fundamental part of the religious observance as long as the temple was standing. Therefore, it is not so surprising that it should be part of the early religious system, which the Christians built upon. Furthermore, and there's a huge debate about this, human sacrifice may have existed in the ancient world and may have existed in ancient Israel. It certainly did exist among the Phoenicians, especially in the Phoenician colonies in northern Africa, in Carthage. There's very good archaeological evidence for this. Many people read Genesis chapter 22, the binding of Isaac, as a polemic against child sacrifice. Okay, I don't know if that's the best reading of the text. I don't think it is. But if you're going to read it as a polemic against child sacrifice, that must mean that child sacrifice did, at least in some extenuating circumstances, exist in ancient Israel. So that too maybe is something that is being picked up in these very early texts of the Christ believers.
Right. The thing with John that may be helpful here, echo, is that Jesus in John looks very much like Dionysus, who's the god of wine. The first sign that Jesus does in the Gospel of John is the wedding at Cana in John chapter 2. He turns water into wine. Well, Dionysus and his cult was really doing quite well. It was quite thriving in the first century, also known as the cult of Bacchus. One of the traditions is that Dionysus dies and then he comes back again. So even some of the sacrificial material not only relates to what we might call pagan sacrifice, because there's a temple in every pagan city where folks are offering sacrifices, but you also have these additional traditions of various gods dying and rising, not just in the ancient Near East, but also in first century Greece and Rome.
All right. So I'd like to thank both of you for joining me today. This was great. And before I close, I'd like to bring this up on the screen. Dr. Kip Davis was watching the stream. He says, at History Valley, please deliver my greetings to Professor Marc Brettler. It's been a long time, an excellent stream with two excellent scholars.
Hey, Kip, it's great to hear from you. I hope you're doing well.
I'll go ahead and play the outro, and thank you both once again.
Always a pleasure to talk to you.
Yeah, thanks. Great questions. Really wonderful conversation. I appreciate it.
Next time.
Yep.
Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.